Ellie sat alone in her car, the dashboard casting a soft amber hue over her tear-streaked face. Her fingers, shaky and cold, kept twisting the ring on her left hand, a habit she hadn't even noticed she'd picked up. Outside, the streetlights blurred through her windshield, but she wasn't really seeing them. Her thoughts were stuck circling the same memory again and again, the moment her world split open. Just a few hours earlier, she had followed Marcus across town. Something inside her had been gnawing for weeks, and she could no longer ignore it. And there he was, sitting in their favorite restaurant across from a much younger woman, laughing. With the kind of ease that used to be reserved for her. It wasn't just a dinner, it wasn't some work thing. Ellie watched as the woman leaned closer, her hand brushing Marcus's. That small, familiar gesture sliced deeper than anything else. She felt frozen behind the wheel, like her lungs forgot how to breathe. Her heart pounded so loudly it was all she could hear. She had imagined all kinds of ways this confrontation might go, barging in, screaming, demanding answers. But in that moment, she did none of those things. She simply turned away, the weight in her chest so heavy she could barely sit upright. Now back in her car, the silence felt crushing. She wiped her cheeks with her sleeve, but the tears kept coming. Her hand dropped to her belly, a gentle, instinctive move, and she closed her eyes to steady herself. "It's not just about me anymore," she whispered. "I have to think about you now." Her other hand joined the first, forming a protective cradle over her stomach. That small motion shattered her all over again. Eventually, she started the engine and drove home. But every turn of the wheel, every red light brought back memories she couldn't silence. Her love story with Marcus had felt like magic at the start, almost too good to be real. She still remembered the night they met, at a university networking. An event she hadn't even wanted to attend. Her roommate practically dragged her there, promising it'd be fun. Ellie had stood awkwardly by the drink table, lemonade in hand, doing her best to avoid eye contact with anyone. And then Marcus walked up, his tie a little loose, his smile easy. "Quite the party, huh?" he said, pointing toward the small crowd. She smiled, unsure why he'd picked her to talk to, but grateful nonetheless. "I'm Marcus," he said, offering a handshake. "Ellie," she replied. His grip was warm and firm, not aggressive, and for some reason that stayed with her. They ended up talking the entire evening, about how neither of them wanted to be there, how he worked in the campus bookstore to save for grad school, how she dreamed of curating exhibitions that told stories through everyday objects. "Like what?" he asked, genuinely interested. "Like a pair of worn boots or a chipped teacup," she said shyly. "Stuff that shows who people really were." He didn't laugh or dismiss her dream. "That's amazing," he said. "I'd love to see that kind of exhibit one day." 1 week later, he asked her out. Their first date was at a local coffee shop with mismatched furniture and a cranky barista. "Okay, serious question," Marcus said mid-sip. "If you could eat only one food for life, what would it be?" "Pizza," Ellie answered without hesitation. "It's flexible and perfect." "That's cheating," he laughed. "Toppings don't count." "Then I'd starve," she shrugged dramatically. They both cracked up. That date, like so many that followed, felt easy, uncomplicated. They would stay up late walking around campus, talking about the future as if it was something they already owned. And when he proposed 3 years later, it was in her parents' backyard under fairy lights he'd strung himself. The moment he dropped to one knee, her heart nearly exploded. "Ellie," he said, holding a small velvet box, "you've made me better in every way. I can't imagine my future without you in it. Will you marry me?" Tears poured down her face as she nodded and said, "Yes. Of course, yes." They danced barefoot on the grass that night, drunk on dreams and fairy lights, convinced they had everything figured out. And for a long time, it really felt that way. Their first apartment was tiny, a little worn down, but it felt like home. On move-in day, Marcus carried her through the front door and accidentally bumped her head on the frame. "Smooth entrance," she teased, laughing. "Only the best for my wife," he replied with a grin. They spent their first night eating takeout, on the floor, surrounded by unopened boxes. When Marcus spilled soy sauce on the carpet, she joked, "Well, guess we're buying a rug sooner than we planned." He leaned in and kissed her, tasting faintly of sesame chicken. They painted walls in warm yellows, hung up clearance bin curtains, and rearranged their thrift store furniture half a dozen times. He always let her have the final say. "You've got the eye," he'd say. "I just lift things." Late one night, while unpacking the last box, their favorite song came on the radio. Marcus stood up, brushed off his jeans, and extended a hand. "Dance with me," he said. "Here?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Why not?" He grinned. She laughed and let him pull her up. They danced barefoot under the soft glow of a single. And in that quiet moment, Ellie felt like everything was exactly as it should be. Before we continue the story, if you're new here, please consider subscribing to our channel. It really helps us keep making stories like this. Life wasn't always perfect, but they had found a rhythm that worked. There were long nights, of course. Marcus sometimes came home exhausted from client meetings, and Ellie would greet him at the door with a quiet hug and a hot cup of chamomile tea. He'd collapse onto the couch, vent about a rough day, and she'd reassure him. "You've got this, you always do," she'd say, meaning every word. And then there were times when she was the one falling apart, like the month she was passed over for a museum role she'd worked hard for. Marcus had held her tightly that night as she cried into his chest, whispering, "They have no idea what they just lost." "You're going to shine, Ellie." They celebrated small victories. A decent raise, a weekend getaway, even replacing their old microwave that sparked every time it ran. And then came the news that shifted everything. Ellie was pregnant. She'd been feeling off for a while, lightheaded, emotional, and more tired than usual. At first, she chalked it up to stress, but after missing her period, she took the test. And just like that, her life changed. When Marcus got home that night, she couldn't hold it in. "I have something to show you," she said practically, vibrating with nerves as she pulled him into the kitchen and handed him the test. He stared at it, blinking, trying to process. Then his face split into a wide, stunned smile. "Are you serious?" he asked, nearly breathless. Ellie nodded, her voice cracking. "We're having a baby." He laughed and picked her up, spinning her in a circle. "We're going to be parents," he shouted. That night, they stayed up late talking about names, nursery colors, and baby socks. It felt magical. The following weeks were a blur of excitement. Ellie dived headfirst into setting up the nursery, painting the walls in soft lavender and ordering tiny outfits that made her tear up with joy. Marcus helped too, building furniture, hanging shelves, and making jokes about how useless he was at folding baby clothes. "You're nesting hard," he'd tease, watching her label drawers and sort onesies by size. One evening, as they folded a pile of baby laundry together, Ellie held up a onesie no bigger than her hand. "Can you believe someone this small? It was about to change everything?" Marcus smiled and brushed her hair behind her ear. "I don't know how we got so lucky," he said quietly. But soon after, cracks started to form. It began slowly. Marcus working longer hours, his phone lighting up more often. At first, Ellie didn't think much of it. A promotion came with more responsibility, and she understood that. "It's just this season," he said one morning while rushing out the door. "It'll calm down soon, promise." She tried to believe him. After all, ambition had always been part of who he was. But over time, a few more late nights became a pattern. Dinner would sit untouched on the table. Candles burned down to stubs. She would wait for him with hope, only to be met with distracted apologies when he finally walked in, eyes glued to his phone. "It's work," he'd insist whenever she asked. "You know how demanding things are." Ellie wanted to be understanding. She didn't want to become the needy, emotional, pregnant wife. But one evening, as she cleaned out his coat pockets before laundry, she found a receipt, an expensive necklace from a high-end boutique she'd never seen before. Her stomach knotted. That night, while he sat scrolling on the couch, she held up the receipt. "What's this for?" Marcus glanced up briefly. "Oh, that?" Just a gift for a client. You know, keeping relationships smooth. She raised an eyebrow. Since when do client gifts include jewelry? He gave a clipped laugh. You're overthinking it, Elle. It's nothing. She tried to let it go, but the doubt had already taken root. He kept his phone closer now, never setting it down face up, even taking it into the bathroom. She caught him smiling at it once, a warm, private smile that felt unfamiliar. Who's that? She asked, doing her best to sound casual. Work. He replied quickly, locking the screen and setting it face down. Just updates. You seem really happy about work lately. He didn't answer. Still, she tried to bridge the growing distance. She planned little date nights, cooked his favorite dishes, but he always had a reason to stay late, or he'd come home too tired to engage. The loneliness wrapped around her like a thick blanket. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing week. Everything came to a head one Friday evening. Marcus had promised he'd be home early. Ellie had spent hours preparing, his favorite pasta, candles, the whole table set like old times. But as the clock ticked past 8, then 9, she felt her patience unraveling. She called him, no answer. Sent a text, "Are you okay?" An hour later, he replied, "Got caught up, don't wait up." Her hands trembled. Something wasn't right. She walked into the bedroom and noticed his briefcase near the closet. On instinct, she opened. Inside was a printed itinerary for a weekend conference he'd never mentioned. But what made her freeze was the handwritten note scribbled in the corner. Make sure Clara has everything she needs for the trip. Clara. A name she had only vaguely heard before, her vision blurred. She sat on the edge of the bed, the paper crumpling slightly in her grip. Later that night, he slipped into bed beside her, checking his phone one last time before turning off the light. Ellie lay still, her back to him, staring into the dark. Her thoughts were loud. So loud. She didn't want to believe it. But deep down she knew. This wasn't just a rough patch. This was betrayal hiding in plain sight. Ellie couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned until the early hours, her mind spinning like a carousel stuck on the worst moment. The name Clara echoed over and over again. She got up just before sunrise, pacing quietly through the house in the dim light, her hand never straying far from her belly. She hadn't planned it. There was no dramatic decision. Her legs just carried her to the front door, keys in hand, like her heart was leading and her mind had no choice but to follow. She drove through the quiet streets, with only one destination in mind, wherever Marcus was supposed to be. He had said he had meetings. He had said not to wait. But Ellie didn't believe a word anymore. She parked a few spots away from a cozy little restaurant tucked behind an office plaza, the kind of place they used to call their spot back, when things still felt magical. And there he was, stepping out of his car, adjusting his jacket and checking his phone with a strange calm that made her stomach churn. Then came Clara. She walked up with a confident sway, dressed like she belonged, on the cover of a lifestyle blog, effortless and polished. She smiled up at him, and he returned it without hesitation. He even reached out to touch her back gently as they walked inside. Ellie's throat tightened. That smile. It used to be hers. That familiar gesture. The easy laugh he gave Clara. It broke something deeper than anger. Ellie sat frozen in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She couldn't storm in. Not like this. She didn't want a scene. She wanted clarity. Instead, she watched. Her eyes followed them as they sat by the window, lit warmly by string lights and candles. It was romantic, too romantic to ignore. The way Marcus leaned in, the way Clara laughed at his words. None of it looked accidental. Ellie felt like she was watching someone else's movie, only she'd been cut from the final script. After what felt like hours, she finally turned the ignition and drove back home, numb and quiet. The house greeted her with that same suffocating stillness. She set her keys down slowly, every movement deliberate, as though speeding up might make the pain come faster. On the fridge was the ultrasound photo, the little black and white image she had smiled at every morning. She reached for it, fingers brushing the glossy paper, and caught her reflection in the metal surface. Puffy eyes, red cheeks, an expression she barely recognized. She wanted to crumble, to fall to the floor and sob until it stopped hurting. But then she felt it, a small flutter beneath her palm, a tiny reminder that she wasn't alone, that life was still growing inside her. And just like that, the sorrow began to turn into something else. Resolve. She didn't cry as she walked through the nursery. She didn't waver as she picked up the soft baby blanket she had folded earlier that week. She brought it to her face, inhaling the soft scent of lavender detergent, and whispered, "I'm sorry. You deserve better than this." Her grip on the blanket tightened. No more waiting, no more hoping he would fix it. He had made his choices. Now she would make hers. She moved to the bookshelf and began pulling down their photo albums. One by one she flipped through them. Wedding shots, birthday parties, road trips. The smiles looked fake now, like they belonged to strangers. She packed the albums into a box and taped it shut. Not to forget, but to clear the space. Her future needed room to breathe. Later that night, she sat at her desk and opened her laptop. The lamp cast a soft glow across the room. The baby monitor beside her hummed faintly. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard before she created a new folder on her desktop. She labeled it simply, Marcus, Evidence. And then, one by one, she began uploading everything she had, screenshots of messages he thought were deleted, receipts, pictures she'd snapped from her car. Each one burned to look at. But Ellie didn't let herself pause. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. For her and the baby. A picture of them on vacation sat on the desk. She turned it face down. That version of Marcus didn't exist anymore. The next morning, Ellie ordered a small, discreet camera online. The kind that looked like a key fob, but could record both video and audio. When it arrived, she practiced using it until she was confident she wouldn't mess it up. The first time she used it, she parked across the street from Marcus's office. The camera rested quietly in her purse, angled toward the front entrance. She watched as Clara joined him by his car, her hand brushing his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ellie didn't cry this time. She just watched. She took the photos. She recorded the footage. "Stay focused," she whispered to herself. "You can't afford to fall apart now." The next few weeks were a blur of quiet strategy. She visited a lawyer, recommended by a friend who had once walked a similar road. The office was modest, the lawyer kind and direct. Her name was Denise. She didn't waste time sugarcoating. "You're doing the right thing," Denise said as she reviewed the evidence Ellie provided. "The court takes this kind of documentation seriously, especially when a child is involved." Ellie sat upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I just need to make sure he can't manipulate this situation. I won't let him twist things to make himself look like the victim." Denise nodded. "Then we'll make sure the truth speaks for itself." That meeting left Ellie with a stack of paperwork and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Power. At home, she continued her performance, smiling when he walked in, asking about his day, pretending not to notice the late nights and the secret texts. But at night, after Marcus fell asleep, she'd return to her desk. She'd sort through evidence, take notes, highlight dates. Every page, every message, every late-night excuse. She cataloged it all. She knew what was coming. And this time, she would be ready. The office was nearly deserted by the time Clara shut down her computer. It was well past working hours, but staying late had become a habit lately. She preferred the quiet. No distractions, just the soft hum of the lights above and the occasional distant elevator ding. She glanced toward the hallway, expecting to be alone, until Marcus appeared, leaning casually against her doorway with 2 paper cups in hand. "You really don't leave, do you?" he asked with a teasing grin. Clara smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're one to talk. That tie's been hanging off your neck since lunch." He chuckled and stepped inside, placing one of the cups on her desk. "Thought you might need a caffeine boost." "Thanks," she said, surprised. "You didn't have to." Just taking care of my favorite teammate, Marcus replied, winking. He always knew how to say the right thing. He had a charm that made people lean in, and Clara had fallen into that orbit faster than she meant to. At first, it was just work. Long evenings spent finalizing presentations, aligning strategies, sharing stories about clients. But slowly, something else crept in. A closeness, a rhythm that felt personal. He asked about her career goals. Remembered the little things. Her favorite coffee order, the podcast she loved, her upcoming trip to visit family. And every time he made her laugh, it felt like a connection was deepening, whether she admitted it or not. One night, as they wrapped up another project, Clara closed her laptop and looked up. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice softer than usual. "Sure," Marcus replied, leaning back. Us working late, talking all the time. It kind of feels like more than just office stuff. I mean, are you single?" There was a pause. Marcus's face shifted just briefly. Then came the same charming smile. "It's complicated," he said, his tone dropping. "I'm in the middle of separating. It hasn't been announced yet, but it's happening." Clara nodded slowly. "I didn't know. It's not something I go around talking about," he replied. "We've been going through the motions for a while, living in the same space but not really together, you know?" "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, unsure of what else to say. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice low and sincere. "These nights talking to you, they've been the only part of my day that feels real." She wanted to believe him, and in that moment, she did. But while Clara felt flattered, even hopeful, Ellie was working in the background, gathering evidence, documenting every interaction, preparing for what was next. She wasn't going to confront Marcus in anger. She wasn't going to explode. That would be too easy for him to dismiss. No, she had something else in mind. Something deliberate, public, unforgettable. The baby shower, or what everyone thought was a baby shower, became the perfect setup. Ellie had planned it down to the smallest detail. The guest list included not just family and close friends, but Marcus's co-workers, his college buddies, and even his boss. The house was transformed with soft white drapes, pastel florals, fairy lights, and picture-perfect decorations. No one suspected that this elegant celebration was actually a stage. Marcus, ever the performer, played his part well. He smiled, poured sparkling water into Ellie's glass, chatted up guests with ease, and kissed her on the cheek like a devoted husband. "Everything looks amazing," he whispered, his hand resting gently on her lower back. "You did all this?" "Of course," Ellie replied sweetly. "It's a special night." He nodded, seemingly touched. "You're incredible." Ellie just smiled. Right on cue, her phone vibrated. A text notification popped up. "Clara has arrived." Ellie's chest tightened. She had sent the anonymous invite herself, carefully worded as if Marcus had written it. A surprise celebration. Wear something elegant. Clara, dressed to impress, stepped inside just moments later, drawing glances from nearly everyone. Her black dress hugged her form like it was made for the occasion. Her makeup was flawless, her hair cascading in perfect waves. But her eyes darted around uncertainly, searching for Marcus. Ellie approached her with a warm smile. "You must be Clara," she said, her tone smooth and welcoming. Clara blinked. "Yes, I'm a friend of Marcus." "Oh, I know who you are," Ellie said softly. "He's spoken about you." Clara's eyes widened. "He has?" Ellie nodded, motioning toward the guests. "Make yourself comfortable. It's a very special evening for all of us." Clara looked confused but nodded politely, still scanning the crowd. She hadn't expected Ellie to know about her. She definitely hadn't expected her to be so calm. Ellie stepped away, walking toward Marcus, who was mid-conversation with a co-worker. The moment he saw Clara, his entire expression changed. He tensed, his smile faltered, and his wine glass nearly slipped from his fingers. He moved fast, intercepting Clara near the entry. "What are you doing here?" he whispered sharply. "I got your message," she replied, brows furrowed. "You invited me." Marcus's voice lowered further. Just stay out of sight, okay? Don't make this weird. Clara hesitated. Is everything okay? I'll explain later, he said, barely meeting her eyes. Ellie saw it all unfold from across the room. The nervous glances, the hushed tones, the tension rising in Marcus's body like he was about to snap. But she waited. Not yet. Dinner was served. Laughter returned. Guests clinked glasses and exchanged toasts. But beneath it all, Ellie could feel the pressure building. And as dessert was cleared, she rose from her seat and gently tapped her spoon against her glass. May I have everyone's attention? The room fell silent. She smiled gracefully and placed one hand over her belly. First, I just want to thank everyone for being here. This night means so much to us, to celebrate the life we've created and the love we've built. Marcus watched her, a soft expression on his face. I also thought it'd be nice, she continued, to share a little tribute, some of our favorite memories. She gestured toward the large screen. The lights dimmed. The first photo appeared, Ellie and Marcus, laughing at their wedding. Awes and smiles followed. A vacation photo, their anniversary dinner, moments of joy frozen in time. Then, the shift. A new image flickered onto the screen. Marcus and Clara at a candlelit dinner, his hand resting on hers. Whispers erupted, then gasps. Another photo followed, a screenshot of texts, another, a receipt for a boutique necklace. Ellie didn't look away. She didn't blink. She stood at the center of it all, calm, composed, while Marcus shrank into his chair, panic rising in his eyes like floodwater. The room felt like it had been doused in ice water. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and glasses were quietly set, down without a single clink. On screen, another image replaced the last, this time a selfie of Marcus and Clara in what looked like a hotel room, both smiling, unaware of the world that would soon judge them. The slideshow rolled on, methodical and deliberate. Screenshots of texts with late-night hearts. Travel receipts with Clara's name listed next to Marcus's. Ellie had left nothing out. Marcus sat frozen, his jaw clenched, wine glass still in hand but barely touching his lips. His face had gone pale. Across from him, Clara stood motionless. Near the door, her confident posture now replaced with one of disbelief. She looked from the screen to Marcus and back, horror dawning with every passing frame. The final slide faded to black, and in that breathless pause, Ellie stepped forward. Her voice was calm, measured, but it sliced through the silence like glass. While I was preparing our home for a baby, planning our future, you were living a lie. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. Clara's eyes were wide now, brimming with realization. You said you were separated, she stammered, her voice cracking. Ellie turned toward her with a measured look. Funny. That's news to me, and to the baby we're having together. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. You told me she knew. You said it was over. I never said that, Marcus whispered hoarsely. Clara, I was going to explain. Clara stepped back, shaking her head. Don't. Just don't. Ellie let the silence linger a few seconds longer before reaching under the table. She pulled out a neatly organized folder and walked over to Marcus, placing it in front of him with quiet precision. Inside are the divorce papers, she said, firmly. The lawyer's already been briefed. I've kept every record, every receipt, every lie. Marcus blinked, his mouth slightly open. Ellie, please, don't do this. We can fix it. I messed up, but we can come back from this. You don't get to fix this, Ellie replied, her voice trembling only slightly. This wasn't a mistake, Marcus. This was a choice over and over again. Clara stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, visibly trembling. You lied to both of us, she said coldly. I believed you. I defended you. I thought I knew who you were. Marcus turned to her, desperation overtaking him. Clara, wait. Just let me explain. I don't need an explanation. She snapped. I need distance. She turned sharply and strode toward the door, heels clicking like hammers. Before exiting, she looked back at Marcus one last time. Whatever fantasy you sold me, I hope it was worth it." Then the door slammed shut behind her, echoing through the stunned silence. The guests were speechless. Some looked away. Others watched Marcus with a mixture of disgust and pity. His co-workers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Even his parents couldn't hide the shame on their faces. Ellie stepped back, standing tall with her hands calmly resting on her belly. "This isn't just about betrayal," she said. "It's about boundaries, about knowing when to stop sacrificing your own worth for someone who doesn't value it." Marcus stood, his voice barely audible. "Ellie, I still love you." She looked him in the eye, her expression clear and resolute. "No, you don't. You love comfort, you love the idea of me, of a loyal wife and a perfect life. But you never loved me enough to protect it." Her voice didn't waver, even as her fingers lightly trembled. "You don't get to stand next to me in the delivery room. You don't get to send flowers when it's convenient. You lost that right the moment you started building a life with someone else behind my back." He was silent, defeated. As she turned to walk away, the room didn't move. The guests watched, unsure if they were allowed to breathe yet. Ellie passed by each table like a quiet storm, composed but powerful, heading toward the hallway. But before she disappeared through the double doors, she paused, looked back once more, and said softly, "Good luck explaining this one." Marcus collapsed into his seat, hands trembling. His future had unraveled in front of everyone. Back at home, Ellie sat on the edge of the crib, her body heavy from the weight of the night. Her baby kicked gently inside her, and she placed her hand there with a soft smile. She picked up her journal, the same one she had written in months ago when the world was falling apart. This time her pen didn't shake. "You are why I fought," she wrote. "You are why I stayed quiet long enough to gather my strength. You are why I walked away without looking back." She closed the journal and whispered, "We're going to be okay. Better than okay." Outside, the sky was beginning to change, a soft pink glow stretching across the horizon. It wasn't just another morning. It was the start of a different kind of life, one where Ellie would write the rules, where no one else could steal her peace again. The courtroom was wrapped in a heavy silence, one that made even the creak of a chair seem too loud. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, dressed in a suit that suddenly felt too tight. His hands were clasped on the polished wooden surface, his eyes stealing glances at the woman sitting across from him. Ellie didn't look back. She sat tall, composed, her lawyer flipping through a well-prepared binder stacked with every shred of evidence she had gathered over those long, lonely nights. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. The proceedings had stretched. For weeks, each hearing peeling back more layers of the man Marcus had tried so hard to portray. Successful, responsible, loyal. But no matter how polished his image, the truth refused to stay hidden. Exhibit after exhibit told a very different story. Photos of Marcus and Clara, messages filled with flirtation and intimacy, bank statements revealing hotel stays, gift purchases, and expenses with no business justification. Ellie's lawyer was precise and relentless. "Your Honor," she said one afternoon, voice steady and firm, "my client has prioritized her child's stability from the moment she discovered her pregnancy. She has documented neglect, infidelity, and emotional distress. This is not just a failed marriage. It's a pattern of behavior unfit for a healthy co-parenting dynamic." Marcus's attorney, a man known for swaying tough judges, tried to spin a different narrative. "Yes, Mr. Bennett made mistakes," he admitted. "But he is committed to change. He wants to be present for his child's future. One mistake does not erase a man's right to be a father." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with decades of experience, listened without emotion. Her eyes flicked between both parties with practiced neutrality. She wasn't here to validate Marcus's charm. She was here to protect a child. Ellie didn't say much in court. She didn't need to. Her documentation spoke louder than anything she could have added aloud. She sat through it all with calm resolve, knowing each step forward brought her closer to the life she deserved. When the day of the final hearing arrived, the judge's verdict was brief but decisive. After reviewing the evidence and considering the emotional stability of the environment, primary custody will be granted to Ms. Ellis. Mr. Bennett will have supervised visitation privileges and will be required to provide monthly financial support as determined by the court. Marcus's heart dropped. He swallowed hard and turned his head, hoping to catch Ellie's eye, searching for some flicker of sympathy, some thread of the connection they once shared. But she was already collecting her documents, her lawyer, leaning in to whisper something that made her nod quietly. The court officer gestured for them to begin clearing the room. Marcus remained seated as others rose and filed out. Even the weight of his attorney's hand on his shoulder couldn't ground him. Later that evening, Marcus returned to the house that once felt alive. Now, it was just drywall and echoes. He walked into the living room, the silence pressing against his chest. The furniture sat untouched. The baby books Ellie had bought were gone. The framed ultrasound photo, however, still remained on the coffee table, left behind either by accident or intention. He picked it up with trembling fingers, really looking at it for the first time. This was his child, his future. And yet, he had done everything to put himself on the outside of it. Marcus sat down heavily on the couch, his eyes sweeping across the now barren shelves. Most of the pictures were gone. Only a few remained. Their wedding photo tucked behind another frame, and a vacation shot from the early years when love still lived in his smile. His throat tightened. The people who once filled this space, Ellie, her friends, his parents, even his own, had distanced themselves. After the slideshow, after the public fallout, even his father had said, "You really messed this up, son," before hanging up the phone. His mother hadn't spoken to him since. The realization came slowly, like dusk swallowing the light. He hadn't just lost his marriage. He'd lost the foundation of everything that had once mattered. Respect, trust, a family. He clutched the ultrasound photo to his chest and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had done broke through. His denial. It wasn't just one affair, it was 1,000 missed chances to do right. 1,000 choices where he had picked ego over love. Tears came, hot and fast, streaking down his face. No one was there to see. No one was there to console. And perhaps that was the point. Meanwhile, across town, Ellie stood in her new kitchen, smaller, cozier but filled with light. The windows were open, and the fresh air brought in the scent of blooming jasmine from the yard. She watched the soft curtains sway in the breeze as her baby girl slept peacefully in the nearby bassinet. Ellie wasn't celebrating. She wasn't throwing victory parties or gloating. But she was free from lies, from emotional exhaustion, from always being the one to keep things together. She had started decorating the nursery again. This time, it was on her terms. The colors were soft cream and sky blue, a mix she found calming. She painted tiny clouds on the wall herself, a brush in one hand and her daughter in a carrier on her chest. Every day was still hard. There were diapers and 3 a.m. feedings and moments where loneliness tried to creep back in. But now, it wasn't the kind of loneliness that came from being lied to. It was simply the silence of a fresh start. She had friends again, real ones. Sarah visited often, always bringing muffins and new stories to tell. Ellie had even started working part-time remotely for a local gallery, curating online exhibits while her daughter napped. Bit by bit, she was reclaiming pieces of herself. One evening, as twilight fell, Ellie stood by the window holding her baby and watching the sky turn gold. "We're safe now," she whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "We're free." Weeks turned into months, and the little home Ellie had moved into slowly became something more, hers. Not a backup plan, not a temporary retreat, a real home. The kind of place where she could exhale, wake up without dread, and build something beautiful from scratch. The nursery was finished now, soft clouds painted across one wall, a tiny bookshelf lined with baby board books, and a mobile hanging, gently over the crib, twirling in the breeze from the open window. Ellie rocked her daughter in the nursery chair, humming softly as the baby's breathing slowed. There were days when the weight of everything hit her out of nowhere. The betrayal, the court hearings, the fear she'd once felt about being a single mother. But those moments didn't define her anymore. They didn't own her. She had survived the storm, and now she was walking in the calm that came after it. Some mornings she'd sip tea on the porch while her daughter napped, her journal resting in her lap. On one such morning, she opened to the final page and wrote, "This isn't the ending I imagined, but maybe it's better, because I found myself here. I found peace." Her phone buzzed on the armrest beside her. A text from Sarah. "Lunch still on today? I'm bringing something fun." Ellie smiled. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed having people in her life who truly saw her. Sarah had become a lifeline, one of the few friends who showed up without being asked, without judgment, and without gossip. The kind of friend who brought laughter and support in equal measure. They met at a small cafe on Main Street, where the waitress always remembered their order, and the corner table stayed open like it was waiting just for them. Sarah slid into the booth with a dramatic sigh. "Okay, you have to see what my nephew drew. He insists it's a dinosaur, but I swear it's a dog in a wig." Ellie laughed, a genuine belly-deep laugh she hadn't heard from herself in months. "Show me." As they passed the drawing back and forth and swapped stories, a few people in the cafe recognized Ellie. Not because she was famous, but because, in a town like this, word gets around. Some smiled politely. One or two avoided eye contact entirely, probably unsure what to say. But Ellie didn't mind. Let them talk, let them whisper. She had nothing to hide, and nothing left to prove. Later that week, while organizing boxes in her hallway closet, Ellie came across something unexpected: the wedding album. She hadn't remembered packing it. She stared at it for a moment, then carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. The first page opened to a picture of her and Marcus dancing beneath fairy lights, barefoot on the grass. Her smile in the photo was pure, untouched by doubt. She didn't cry. She didn't tear the album apart or throw it away. Instead, she closed it gently, then stood and walked it out to the garage. She placed it on the top shelf, tucked behind some holiday decorations. It wasn't her story anymore, but it had once been. And that part didn't need to be erased, just archived. As the seasons changed, so did Ellie. She started accepting small freelance projects at the local museum, helping plan exhibits. It wasn't the grand curatorial dream she once had in college, but it was something she could build from. Something honest, something hers. One afternoon, while pushing the stroller through the park, Ellie ran into Marcus's mother near the duck pond. The older woman looked uncertain at first, like she wasn't sure if she'd be welcomed, but Ellie greeted her with a calm nod. "She's beautiful," Marcus's mom said softly, gazing down at the baby. "She really is," Ellie replied, her voice kind but distant. There was a pause. "He knows what he lost," she added after a moment. "I hope he does," Ellie said. "For her sake." The woman nodded and stepped back. "You're doing a good job, Ellie." "Thanks," she said. "I know." Later that evening, Ellie sat in the living room with her daughter, who was lying on a blanket kicking her tiny legs. The light outside had gone soft and golden. Ellie picked up her journal again and wrote, "You are why I chose strength. You are why I let go. You are why I don't regret a single step forward." She closed the book, leaned back into the cushions, and smiled at the little girl grinning up at her. "We're okay now," she whispered, "and I'm so proud of us." Across town, Marcus sat alone on the back porch of a rental house, watching the same sunset Ellie had just smiled beneath. He had started therapy, not because he wanted to heal for himself, but because a court order demanded it. His supervised visits were awkward and short. He rarely spoke during them. He'd bring stuffed animals or baby clothes he thought were thoughtful, but Ellie never engaged beyond what was necessary. She wasn't cruel. Just done. And that stung more than anything. He flipped through photos on his phone one evening, some old, some new. He stopped at the ultrasound photo and stared at it. He didn't cry this time. Not because it didn't hurt, but because he'd cried enough. Now he just felt empty. His choices had caught up with him, and all that was left were memories of a life that no longer existed. Back at Ellie's home, the baby monitor buzzed softly as her daughter dozed peacefully in the crib. Ellie walked down the hallway, turning off lights, humming quietly to herself. She paused by the nursery door, looked in, and whispered one last thing before heading to bed. We're free. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know your favorite moment in the comments.